Could we give another round of applause to the organizers and the supporting staff who have built this amazing event that I've at least had a really good time with, and I hope you have too? Awesome. Okay. So today I want to talk about building open source communities. Before I get started, I'm going to do a quick who am I. My name is Tierney Cyren. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a senior cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. I collaborate on the Node project and a bunch of other open source projects in various different ways. That's basically what you need to know about me. So what is an open source community? Open source is everything, or at least the community side of open source is everything beyond the code. So everything that's not technical, like literally writing lines of code and consuming lines of code, is the community. This includes people coordinating a bunch of different aspects of your community itself, processes, location, funding, social media, blogging, diversity and inclusivity, outreach, moderation, policies, events, documentation, licensing. There's a lot. And everyone has different perspectives on this. And every community has different perspectives and needs around this. So I think like a year and a half ago, I asked what open source community is. And there's a bunch of different responses, and they're all pretty good. And honestly, I agree with all of them. That said, they're all pretty different, and it kind of leads us to understand that there's not consensus around what open source community is, because it's so individual to us as individual contributors, to us as maintainers, to us as consumers. You have to really take into account those aspects when you're asking like such a broad question. Whatever technology you came from originally, whatever you started with, is going to influence how you perceive an open source community. Whatever your personal history is going to influence how you perceive a community in general, and then you're applying open source to that kind of definition that's personal to you. And on top of that, your experiences in open source communities can be both good and positive, and again, differentiate how you perceive an open source community. So everyone's idea is different of what a community is. So taking that, how do you actually build an open source community? It's kind of challenging, but it's also very easy in a lot of ways. And I generally try not to say easy, but it's, I'm using it in this case because it's easy to stumble into it and do it accidentally. And this is how a lot of communities do end up starting. So I'm using easy very intentionally there. Every open source community has a lot of its own quirks and unique aspects, and often those are really good, and often those can be really bad. Luckily, there are some fundamental traits, at least in my experience of the open source communities I've been a part of, that are shared. And these aren't necessarily like, I can give you XYZ answer to a problem. These are kind of cultural things that are shared and kind of manifest no matter how you get to an open source community, how that open source community evolves and builds up. So let's go into some of the lessons I've personally learned from building open source communities and being a part of open source communities and helping them kind of grow and also seeing them fail. So I'm going to share the ones that are really important to me. So these are the communities I participated in. MyBB is a PHP forum system. It's been around for a very long time. It was created, I think, in like 2006 or something, 2005, which for me is a long time. It's PHP, so very different from JavaScript that we're used to, and kind of the build speed was a very different pace than what we're used to in JavaScript. Tent was a decentralized protocol. The reference implementation was Ruby. That community, woo, Ruby. Interesting choice in this crowd. So Tent was very much an idea and like a definition, similar to kind of what HTTP is. People go implement it. Very interesting community, and one that I really loved, and very sad to have seen it die. IOJS, I assume many of you know what IOJS is, but for those who don't, IOJS is the fork of Node that happened around Node 10 and just before Node 12 shipped. That was basically bringing modern V8 and a bunch of other things to Node. and eventually got merged back into Node.js and got moved under the Node.js Foundation, which is now the OpenJS Foundation. And then there's Node itself. And I know that these kind of merged. I do absolutely classify them as two different communities and two different experiences. And we can get into that a bit later. So, lesson 1, don't build too much. Creating too much structure can be a really bad thing that hinders your community. Specifically, it sets guide rails on how your community can grow and sets implicit expectations about that growth. And it limits what you can do once you begin getting momentum, because people try to stay within those guide rails rather than doing something natural and probably something that you're not going to expect. So my experience in MyBB was I created a website called technoboard.net. If anyone wants to snipe that domain, I didn't do it last night, so you're welcome to. But it was a forum for people who were interested in technology. And I built a lot of structure, because that's how all of the forums I saw were doing it. Turns out that didn't work. There were 2 forums that had a bunch of posts, and then all of the rest were empty. And that creates an environment where, oh, I see a bunch of empty things. This looks dead, and so I'm not going to participate. And so, defining those guide rails and setting up like structure when it's not needed yet is actually really challenging, because it, 1, makes your community look empty, and 2, it limits how you can actually grow naturally. So yeah, that's an example of how to do something that's maybe not the best, because you're trying to do and you're trying to mimic what others do, and that can hamper your actual growth. Additionally, in Node, going through the process of creating a PR and submitting it, and getting it merged and going through the entire process can be a little bit cumbersome and can kind of feel like this, where it's just a cycle. And certain groups in Node have gotten a lot better about this. That said, this process is also very intentional. We do this because it's needed in a lot of cases. Node is a very highly impactful project, and making sure that we're not letting things slip through that shouldn't be slipping through is really important, because we don't want to create a bad experience for the end users, for the people who are using this in production, for the developers like you who are using this on their machines. So that said, in a lot of cases, if you set up too much red tape early on, it can actually limit growth. I ended up setting up too much red tape, or at least trying to. I got a lot of pushback, and I really appreciated it in the Node.js community committee when I started getting involved there. So that there's 2 committees in Node. There's the technical steering committee and the community committee. The technical steering committee focuses on kind of the code side of the project, the inward stuff in the org, and the community committee kind of focuses on outward-facing community outreach stuff. When I was beginning to get involved there, I was like, oh yeah, we need to mimic all of the things that the TSC and working groups do, with a lot of strict rules and governance and like guidelines of how we should be doing things. I got a lot of pushback on that, and rightfully so, because it was going to be limiting the growth of how we can actually engage with the community, and it was very unnecessary at the time, because we didn't actually know if we needed that. Those things existed in the technical steering committee and working groups for a very good reason, because they needed that at that point. Whereas the ComCom was new, the community committee was new, and didn't necessarily need that. And as things grew on, we decided to go down certain paths. We actually differed from the TSC in how they did things, and I'm very glad we did this. Instead of doing working groups and teams, we just went down a pure path of initiatives. And so we have a little bit more control, whereas working groups are like their own bodies that have governance and a bunch of effort. In the ComCom, we've gone a completely different path. And if those things that I had actually PR'd landed, we would not be on that path today. So lesson 2, empower your contributors. So without contributors being empowered, there's not a reason for them to stick around. This is a vital, vital thing to make people feel welcome and like they're making an impact, because they are. You need to actually give them that to make them kind of want to be there and to feel like they own something or like they belong. This is a phrase I like. So enabling contributors enables contributors to enable contributors. So by you doing something to help lift someone else up, that someone that you helped lift up actually helps them go lift other people up. So it becomes a network effect of you being able to grow your community just by being present and welcoming and giving trust to people. And that's something I really believe in, and I've personally seen this happen and be very successful many times. So in Node, we had the Evangelism working group. This was in both Node.js and IO.js. I was involved in both sides of it. I didn't mean to both sides there, but you get the point. It was a working group that was both in IO and Node. We had a pretty tremendous scope of engaging the community. How do you define that? Like, what is that scope? Is that social media? Is that blogging? Is that doing community events locally, providing resources for events? How do you actually get that? And because that scope was so big, we didn't actually necessarily have the resources that we needed to. And so we ended up a little bit like Oliver Twist here, asking for more and not necessarily getting it, not because it wasn't able to be provided, but more because it was too broad and we weren't actually giving them a usable request. And that was a case of a group not necessarily being empowered, and not because of anyone else not empowering them, but because we were not defining our scope well enough to be able to be empowered. And so in that, we eventually kind of split out into the community committee. It's a very long arc that we could go into later if anyone's interested. But basically, they're a new committee that kind of did similar work, was eventually instantiated at the top level of the then Node Foundation. And we kind of got a little bit more to this place, where we were able to have power and define what we were doing a lot better, and actually find success with certain projects and kill off other projects when they weren't needed. And it was a really good way for us to be able to kind of flex that muscle of empowerment and get more people involved actively. Cool. So lesson 3, accept help along the way. The first time I gave this talk, it was to students, student ambassadors, or campus experts for GitHub Education. I, at the time, was chairperson of the community committee and was feeling super burnt out. It was toward the end of my time there, and I had just spent a lot of time on it. And it was just an effort, basically direct correlation to how much time I spent on it, and me not kind of setting boundaries for myself. And also going and trying to do everything by myself. So one of the lessons that I think is really, really important is you can't actually own a community, because at that point it ceases becoming a community. It's a project that you are the owner of. And this kind of I learned about this in Tent. So Tent was intended to be perfect with their 1.0 launch. It turned out that is kind of impossible, and for what it's worth, that actually was the same thing with Node, and we'll get into that in a bit here. But turns out software is never going to be perfect, and to think that is a little bit maybe not correct. So 3 people were working on this. They were doing a really good job, and they had a really good base. But because they were focusing on it being perfect for 1.0, they actually ended up ignoring the massive community that they built, and instead just focusing on their thing. And by not actually letting people contribute in a way that was meaningful, they killed their community. They killed every kind of ounce of goodwill, and every project actually that was built on top of their platform. They killed it because they were trying to own it rather than trying to actually make a community. So it became a little bit like The Ring, where they were really trying to go for the perfect thing, and they owned it. It was theirs, and nobody else could kind of help, because they were the only ones with the vision and the insight to do it. And for what it's worth, they're all wonderful people, and I think it was a really good project, but that's kind of what ended up happening. This is also true. Communities can outgrow the project leadership. This is definitely the case in Node. For a long time, there was a BDFL model, and for context, BDFL is Benevolent Dictator for Life, so it's basically You are someone who owns or runs the project and kind of accepts other help. It too is going to be perfect with 1.0, which is why we're on 0.10 and 0.12 was in development for so long. And throughout the process, I believe there were 3 total BDFLs. Yeah, so those BDFLs did good work for the project, but the project outgrew them, as was shown by IOJS. There was a ton of people who were willing and able to work on Node, but they were the gatekeepers in a certain way that prevented that. So Node has changed from that model through the IOJS fork to a more community-centric model. This focuses on enabling community members, or anyone really, to come and participate and engage and build the platform. And that actually pretty well aligns with my personal experience of getting involved during IOJS and eventually into Node, where I started by a very small contribution that actually got closed because I didn't know how Markdown worked. So I was trying to fix links that were broken, but I was hard linking GitHub instead of doing like the GitHub URLs instead of doing like a correct kind of well-formed link. And now I'm involved in the project because I've been able to dedicate more and more time, and that has actually helped my career in a lot of ways, and I've been able to spend more time actually working on Node itself, or at least the community around it. So by enabling people to grow up in your project, you actually can create leaders for the future. You can create a hiring pipeline if that's important to you and your company, if it's like a corporate open source project. And you can also just generally build a lot of goodwill and care and passion for your community, which is really important if you really want to actually have a open source community. You have to let people flock together and really understand how this is a cohesive group rather than something that I'm running personally. So lesson 4, communicate effectively. This is a very interesting one. In my experience, nobody prefers to communicate the same way as someone else. And I don't mean necessarily how they write, although that is definitely a factor. I actually mean the media that they're choosing, or the medium they're choosing to actually communicate through. Communicating an idea one-on-one and kind of building consensus beforehand is a really effective thing. And doing that on the platform of choice of someone you're trying to communicate with is really, really powerful and impactful. And it's a good way to actually build goodwill with both that person and the community, because you're not presenting something that's highly contentious without kind of understanding everyone at the table and how they can kind of engage with it and where they're standing and maybe understanding their objections as well. So this has kind of been an evolving thing for me. But in that evolution, I've really learned that there are so many platforms that we all prefer to be on, for political reasons or privacy reasons or just access reasons. There's a lot of different things that you have to cater for if you're building an open source community. You have to be willing and open to accepting communication on different media, just because it's the internet landscape for communication is so broad. So whether that's like IRC or Slack or Twitter or email, like Twitter DMs or email or whatever, please be open to that, because that's a really good way to lower the barrier to contributing. That said, you also, if you're not having a centralized communication media, you need to also assert that that's an okay thing, because just assuming that everyone knows that, or that they'll be willing to communicate to you that what their communication preferences are is a challenge. So asserting that you can reach out to us on Twitter, or you can send us an email, or if you're in any of these Slack groups, you're also welcome to do that, or if you're in Discord or IRC or whatever, making sure that you're actually asserting your communication and how you're able to do that, but also being open to having more communication media is really impactful to accessibility in terms of personal and global access. In IOJS, I, as an outsider, took a bunch of approaches. I was super new to like real open source in terms of like something on GitHub that was being developed by a community rather than like just a core team that had their own specific things, and it was very opaque. Instead, in IOJS, it became very transparent of how do we do these things, but I was still really nervous and not really comfortable. I ended up back-channeling a lot of people. Michael Rogers specifically, I back-channeled quite a bit just because I didn't know what I was doing. I also commented on GitHub a lot. I engaged there. GitHub is also a valid communication media. And then, I also reached out to people on Slack, and at the time, Gitter was really popular, so also Gitter. Basically, I just tried to go through all of the channels and make sure I was connecting with people, and that helped me succeed. But I also realized the inverse is true, where if you go to other people, you can help lift them up and help them succeed more. And so by doing that, you're actually building trust and awareness that it's okay to reach out to me on this platform, or it's okay for me to not exist on this required platform that is basically mandated by this project. So certain channels, given that, will eventually emerge as the thing your team or your group or your community needs and uses once you hit a certain scale. In Node, there isn't actually a suggested way of how we can real-time talk to each other. There's been many long and contentious proposals about IRC versus Slack versus Discord versus whatever other platform. And we've kind of decided that we're not going to have a centralized communication platform outside of GitHub just because there are too many people who care too passionately about it. And it's like, you would be surprised at how contentious setting up a Slack is. It's real hard. So, I think there's a lot of benefit in that, though, in that we as individuals can go and talk to each other outside of that and also set up bespoke groups where, in the OpenJS Foundation Slack, we have a Node.js channel. We can talk there. There's also the Node.js Slack, the unofficial community Node.js Slack that we have brought in as, a community project that we really appreciate, and I talked to a lot of people on there. There's a lot of media that we can actually go and use, and this actually ends up being beneficial because it creates multiple routes for new people to come and participate where they might not have found this other route because it's not their normal kind of space that they would live in. So basically, you kind of need to have every communication platform available and be able to communicate through there. And that doesn't mean you as an individual, but it's very, very helpful to have access or be accessible, rather, to everyone via as many platforms as possible. And this it becomes especially true geographically, where certain sites or tools are blocked and others may not be. Or others are preferred, whereas these ones are unknown and nobody's on them in XYZ geographic region. So try to go where people are comfortable. Okay, quick recap. I'm going to let you out a bit early. So the lessons: don't build too much. Please don't build empty communities. Build something that's minimal and then let the community grow naturally. Empower your contributors. Contributors who feel empowered are actually more likely to stay around and contribute and grow in your project and help your project grow rather than kind of floating away once they make a first PR and get a badge on their repo or on their profile. Accept help as a leader. This is a really hard one to accept and to exercise, and if you want help, I'm more than happy to help. But if you don't let others do work, you're not going to have a good time as a leader, and you're eventually going to burn out and not be able to continue. And then communicate with people in different ways. Please allow people to communicate with you how you're comfortable, but also how they're comfortable. And try as a community organizer to cater to your community's needs, which, again, taking into account lesson 1, may be different from what you initially expect. So how you can actually apply these lessons today. Have a scope. Have something that you can really stick to. This helps ensure that you're not creating empty space, and it helps kind of nurture your natural growth. have a path to meaningful contributions. So don't just always suggest, oh yeah, the good first contribution is adding a test. Yes, tests help increase coverage, and they help you kind of as a project become more stable, but that also, like, at the end of the day, doesn't really feel meaningful as a contributor who's coming to your project for the first time, who's coming to your community for the first time. Having something where they can go and help ship a feature, or go and help improve a feature, or go and help do something that actually is impactful and that users of your project or your community will end up seeing is a really good way to do that. Ownership leads down an unhealthy and unhappy path. Owning a community on top of like the toxicity for your own community is also really unhealthy for you, and it's something you should avoid at all costs. I highly recommend this. Onboarding new leaders and onboarding people who care about the project is really important for your success and your own personal health. And then communicate effectively. Have multiple channels. Know that people use them differently, and that's okay, and accept that. But yourself, you should try to use them as effectively as possible to communicate with your community. Thanks.